AP Lang teachers. My name is Lloyd Hoshaw, and I am a AP Lang teacher at Millard West High School, which is a suburb outside Omaha, Nebraska. And I've got a short presentation today about the argumentation element of AP Lang, and I'm going to focus on claims and evidence and reasoning. And I'm going to do that through using a book-length text for argument and synthesis. I've done this at different points in the school year. And so it can work for argument or it can work in synthesis, either way. So I wanted to start with talking about what is argumentation, or reminding you of what our course and exam description says about argumentation. The page number 95 is the PDF version of it if you're looking at it online. And I've just highlighted some of the key skills that they point out for argumentation. We really need to look at how language and structural choices impact the argument. The different kinds of evidence and support. And then the second column there is really where this project gets the kids engaged with formulating their own arguments. So they have to challenge their own assertions, synthesize information. That's really what argument is all about. And although we have the new CED, I always go back to the course description from, I believe, the 2014 AP Lang description. I really focus on these two things. Anytime I'm building a project or adding a text, I ask myself, does it apply to these two goals, these two, two goals of the course? Does it help students develop critical literacy? So critical inquiry, deliberation, reading, writing, listening, and speaking. And does it facilitate informed citizenship in the sense that they can move beyond their academic lives and engage in real conversations about real topics? And so, again, in the CED, there is no specific reading list for AP Lang, but they do talk about different types of reading you can use. We're all used to like speeches and letters that are on the exam, but there is a segment where they tell us that trade books have a place. And I do use at least 2 trade books a year. Extended texts would be when they're talking about things that are outside of the modern contemporary time period. So those of you who are aligned with American literature in your text, you're probably using some of these as well. And then imaginative literature. And this is where it gets interesting. You know, most of us became English teachers because we like novels and poetry and plays. And there is a place for imaginative literature in AP Lang, but you're focusing on when they're trying to accomplish a goal, when they're making an argument. And so, for example, I've used 1984 for years in my classroom, and although fiction, I use it to jumpstart questions and discussion about nonfiction issues like the role of technology in humanity, the role of gender in society. And so, although the text is imaginative literature, it's opening up opportunity to have arguments about the real world. I've used Malcolm Gladwell's David and Goliath. Each chapter is its own set of arguments about the concept of the underdog and who's the underdog. I focus on this book called The Rhythm Boys of Omaha Central because I do teach outside Omaha, which is about the first high school basketball team in Nebraska, which all 5 starters are African American. That happened in 1968, the same year that George Wallace came and campaigned for presidency. And so there's a lot of issues in there about athletics, academics, housing, employment. All those issues become real world issues that we look at. And I've even used Mouse, which is a nonfiction graphic novel about Art Spiegelman and his father and mother's survival through concentration camps in World War II. So any of these texts, the assignment that I'm about ready to share with you, I've used in some way, shape, or form. But the one I'm going to focus on today is The Revenge of Analog, which is, here's a quick blurb about the book itself. And it's essentially his argument of, why do some of these analog elements stick around when we have a digital replacement for it? And I found it really interesting personally because I like records, but it opens up a lot of other opportunities. So here's the different chapters. So the first thing I do is I have students this year, I had students all read the intro, which is the Revenge of Analog thing, or there was an intro before this as to how he got started on the book. And then I had students focus on one chapter as opposed to reading the entire text, but you could have them read the entire text. So I had to choose if they were going to focus on things or if they were going to focus on ideas. And so they chose something of interest: vinyl, paper, film, board games. And then down here, of course, it got really interesting when we started going remote, when they were doing this project, because there was this concept of school: should it be analog or should it be digital? And so the students did have some choice there, and then that formed their own groups. Then what's really important with any book length work is you're going to have to create some sort of guidance with them to help them identify the claims. And so here I just pulled an interview where I would do this with my students as well, where the interviewer is saying, hey, there's a theme that cropped out throughout your book. Well, in AP Lang, we're saying you're making a serious claim here, that there is some sort of that limitation of choices is actually helpful, that vinyl limits your choices, that writing on paper as opposed to digital limits choices that you have or opportunities. And David Sachs replies to that, and essentially is building his argument. And so I would pull things out like this so that they could see that there was an overarching argument to help them then go through the book length work, which is longer than most of the texts that we read. So then I'm just going to walk you through the rest of this, these ways of approaching the text itself. Then what the assignment that I do is I have them moderate a small group discussion and then become a panel of moderators to talk to the whole class, and how that enhances their understanding of argument and dealing with a variety of skills that are in our CED. So here's an example of a major claim that I would pull from his intro. The choice we face isn't between digital and analog. The best ideas emerge from the complexity. Technological innovation isn't a story of a slow march from good to better to best. It's a series of trials that help us understand who we are and how we operate. And then I would share with the students, this is about them being able to identify and describe the overarching thesis of the text. They're looking for claims and evidence that would back it up. So these 3 I's and power dynamics, I'll share with you in a moment. It's touching on those other skills related to claims and evidence. So most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the rhetorical triangle. There are a variety of other ways of drawing this, and I certainly use the rhetorical triangle throughout the class. But I've also started to have great success with this approach. And I actually stole it from Steve Heller, who's another AP Lang teacher and was my consultant during one of my APSIs. And he uses this concept of the 3 I's that you can use this when thinking about speakers, when thinking about audiences, when interpreting impacts or the purpose of something. And I've had great success in my classroom. So the 3 I's are: consider the individuals and communities, consider the institutions or industries, and then connect to the ideologies driving the arguments. And so I've taught this before they would have gotten to this point in the class, but then I take them back to it with whichever chapter they're reading, saying they need to consider all 3 of these. So is it the industries that are driving these changes, like the making of records, or their individuals and communities, or is it about beliefs and values? And how does that all tap in? And so I have some questions to kind of get them thinking once they've read their chapter or their section. And then I always have them do this thing called test, which is just a shorthand annotation on my part to get them to do commentary. I tell them, hey, the AP Lang exam is just a test. Make sure every paragraph you get to the test, which is this evidence suggests that. And they're explaining and interpreting what it means. Hopefully they can break away from that language and that structure, but at the beginning it gives me something really concrete, and I can always come back to it to remind them to get to commentary. So in order to be helpful in argument, they really need to understand the role of the speaker and the audience. And I had some great struggles with students thinking of, well, it's anybody, it's everybody, it's all doctors. And so I started thinking about, well, who figures out the specifics of an audience? And the answer is marketing firms do. That's who does that. And so I found this really nice visual that I use in class. And I tell the students, they don't need to think about all of these, but they need to describe a speaker and audience using 2 or 3 of these categories. Like, is the region important? Is their age important? What is it about their attitudes or the social cultural norms in their community? Or what's their habits or hobbies? And how does that influence their positions, their thoughts, their examples, the choices they they make as writers. And then I always connect to beliefs and values. And I co-teach with an AP US history teacher. So again, this came from a marketing firm that of international businesses and said, well, if you want to sell to Americans, what do Americans value? And so they did all these surveys, and these were the categories they came up with. And so I teach these specifically, but they could be any themes that you do in your class. Like I mentioned with 1984, I do technology shaping humanity. How does that fit into a belief or a value? These are the ones that I use, and they work really well. And you notice that they're broad enough that most topics or prompts that you're familiar with would fit into at least one of these categories, but they're also specific enough that it gives a kid a target to go to, an explanation. This argument is really about freedom. This argument is really about competition. And so then it gives them something to make a comment about and connect to. So the actual assignment looks like this. And again, I'll include these materials, but I'll give you a brief overview here in the video. So I give them the assignment in the background, and then I tell them much of what I've been telling you, like why should you have to be able to do this? Why is this important? And then we get to the actual requirements. And I essentially have them build a text set, like a synthesis question. And I tell them that they need to pull an excerpt from their chapter, from the Wrench of Analog, because I do work with a historical history teacher, AP US history teacher. They must pull something from history or from this text that we read called Lies My Teacher Told Me. They need a non-textual source. So again, I'm thinking synthesis. And then I say, you can pull from something else we've read in this class. So it could be from our textbook. We did read David and Goliath before this assignment. They've had to find articles for various things. They had self-directed research. So if one of those texts worked, they could pull from that. And then I also start opening it up. Well, you could use, for this, since it's not a sit-down project, like a writing task, it's more of a discussion. They could use a podcast. They could use a video. So I open up those opportunities for them. And then they have to compose 3 academic questions. The first question is a definition question. What do these beliefs and values, what do each of these texts tell us about the beliefs and values that you're going to focus on? Then I have them do synthesis with their sources. Then I have them make an ideological argument question. And again, they're not going to write these as essays. They're going to talk about them with their peers in small groups and then come back as a whole group. Each moderator is making their own text set. Each moderator is making their own set of questions. So hopefully when they come together at the end in front of the class, I've got 6 groups that had a small group discussion. When they come together as a whole class, there will be things that connect, but also new things that came out of those groups. So it's a really dynamic experience. It does take a lot of time, but it hits all those argumentation key points that we want to make sure that our students do, but in a different format. Sorry about that. So one of the other things that I do, this year in particular, I had to do it digitally because we had moved into remote learning, is I have kids in small groups once they've read their chapter, work with people who read the same chapter. So discuss claims of value and policy, which we do use language composition. So I've highlighted those pages there. Discuss specific audiences. So I take them back to that chart. They need to narrow down specifically who are the audiences for these different products, these different examples of analog in our world, and which American beliefs and values do they think are great, best in place. Most of them want to pick something like progress in technology, but when they start talking about it, they realize, well, maybe the board game industry isn't really about progress in technology. It's about these other aspects. It's about valuing leisure. Maybe the print magazine is actually about material wealth. And then they're going to start talking to one another about what text do you think will work and how to formulate those questions. And in the end, I tell them their text set is actually establishing and illustrating this concept of a line of reasoning, because as a student goes through their text set, they should begin to hear a conversation. They should begin to see an argument being laid out in front of them, whether that argument is going back and forth, the texts argue against one another, or they build to certain ideas. But that's how I return to that concept of line of reasoning, is that it's more than just your organization. It's actually how that conversation is happening. We do a lot with the Burkean parlor, where this argument's already been happening. This conversation exists. You're entering into it. So who all is talking and whose priorities are in play and how can you contribute? And in this case, they do it in a discussion as opposed to a written essay. And so it turns out to be a really natural, vibrant kind of experience. And so here's the overview connected to the different skills. Again, every student is doing this once for their chapter. They're not doing it for the whole book. It is a difficult task for them to find those texts, but also to write questions that are engaging for their peers. So we do some guidance there about questioning, and I'd like to watch a TED Talk about what makes good questions. And then they participate more often than they're an actual moderator, because they're going to sit in on other people's groups as a participant, read their text sets, participate in a discussion. And it hits so many of these skills. And you don't have to like match this up for everything, hopefully, in your district. But I did here, so that you can see that the things that you're doing in your class that maybe aren't traditionally measurable, they're still hitting those skills and practicing what students need to be able to do. And then you can refer back to that thinking and that process to then formalize it into writing or to inform their choices as a writer. I do have a grade sheet, a rubric for this that they see ahead of time and that I return to. And just this way you get a sense of kind of how all those pieces add in to a grade of some sort that I can record and measure. But really it's the skills that they're going to get to carry with them beyond this moment. Then they always reflect. They do get feedback from their peers anonymously. And then we have this thing called brain gnomes, where I tell them that's who's in charge of getting all the material that they've ever learned and pull it back up for themselves. And so I say, you just need to file key information from all these discussions that you might be able to use in the AP exam, but maybe in real world discussions. This is how I laid it out this year when we were doing it remotely. So there were 2 different chapters that happened each day. They were leading about a 20-minute small group discussion. And then we had about a 15 to 20-minute discussion as a whole Zoom class. In my traditional classroom, it would be about a 35-minute small group discussion. And then it would transition to a whole group discussion. I do teach in blocks. My classes are about 85 minutes long. If you have questions, you can always email me. And this link here will take you to a folder that has the resources, the documents that I've referenced in the video. So I hope you have a great experience developing your own argument tasks and assignments. And good luck, AP Lang teachers.